It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Now we can draw a line under this bitter dispute, cut waiting lists and get our NHS not just back on its feet but fit for the future.
Doctors' strikes are off for now, but is the government right to give public sector workers significant pay rises? Amazon tell their staff to get back to the office. The government say it's OK to work from home. So who's right?
Shortly after the election, my team reached out for advice on what declarations should be made so it's in accordance with the rules.
Why are the Prime Minister and his wife accepting clothes and sports tickets from wealthy donors? And should the Conservatives do a deal with Reform?
We lost 5 seats to Reform UK and people are jumping up and down, and some rather reckless people are saying, well, we must merge with them. Well, that would be fatal.
Joining us today, Labour MP Josh Simons, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, Paul Novak, and former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng, who also stood as a Conservative candidate in July's general election. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this headline in The Guardian. Pint of no return. Who writes these? 2/3 measure could boost English health, according to a study that was carried out by the University of Cambridge. Now, it's an experiment which met a measure of resistance, but resulted in the amount of beer sold falling nearly 10%. But though modest, the drop could lessen the impact of alcohol-related harm. Is it a good idea?
No, not in my view, for so many reasons. I love a pint. The leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, loves a pint. Pubs are places that people come together. They are public goods in a sense. And I'm not comfortable with the government telling people how big their pint glass is at all.
But would you notice if it was 2/3 of a pint?
I mean, the pint is something that we kept all the way through our membership of the European Union. It's what it means to be in a British pub. Oh. And yes, I think people would notice if the pint glass suddenly disappeared.
Ah, well, that's being met with a certain amount of
well, it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of Brexit, isn't it? Can't get rid of the pint. Why do we leave Europe? To save the pint. Got to save the pint to stop us going back into Europe. No, I think it's quite a good idea, actually. I think it's quite interesting. So, do you remember that very strange man, Steve Hilton, who used to work for David Cameron, who's now apparently going to become the governor of California? He set
Where's
up
this going with the pint? But anyway, yes.
He set up this thing called the Nudge Unit, which was actually a very, very good idea. And it was things like, for example, to get students to drink less, you would put up billboards saying, 89% of students at this university don't drink during the week. It was sort of encouraging behaviour. And I think it's quite clever to offer people what looks like a pint, feels like a pint, but isn't a pint, which means you end up drinking perhaps less and get healthier. I am actually quite interventionist, particularly as I'm nominally a Tory, on these issues like sugar taxes and lowering salt in food and that kind of thing. So I think this is an interesting idea that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand.
Right, so you think it could have positive... Well, it did have positive health consequences, even by reducing by that much. What about 2/3 of a pint and half a sandwich?
Well, the danger of being accused of being a wishy-washy metropolitan Liberal, I often drink a schooner, 2/3 of a pint. I don't think there's a cat and hell's chance of the government moving to get rid of pints in pubs, but I think it's good to give people the choice, particularly when lager, for example, is stronger now than it was 20, 30 years ago. So giving people that 2/3 option, I think, is a good one. I'd be more concerned, actually, about people drinking at home and the cost of drink at home. But as I say, I think the pint is safe for the foreseeable future.
Interesting experiment, Anita. I mean, they report that although customers didn't complain, fewer than 1% of venues approached agreed to participate, and the intervention involved only 12 establishments.
Yes, and I think they approached like 1,700 or something. So I think there's a couple of really good points been made on the panel so far. First of all, that most people actually do drink at home. So is this really going to be the thing that's going to dramatically change alcohol consumption? And is it instead just going to hurt pubs who are already struggling, who are a key part of the community? I mean, I should say, incidentally, I'm not a drinker, but I do think that people can make these choices. And I don't think there's enough evidence here that shows that people didn't compensate by, for instance, saying, oh, I've only had 2 pints, I'm not feeling that tipsy. Should I also have a glass of wine, etc.? Or did they drink at home? I think there needs to be more work around this.
Oh, so you think there should be further experiments? I mean, it
It
did result in the
amount of conclusions from this yet. I think it's not clear enough from 12 establishments, not very many, that people did change their behaviour in a significant way. And to have this kind of intervention, I think you need better evidence than this. The other thing that's interesting, I wonder what Josh thinks, is that there are all these conversations about minimum unit pricing of alcohol and whether or not, you've got the Daza report, you've got interest from people like Chris Whitty, Labour, Wes Streeting move in that direction, because I think that could have profound implications, particularly in the cost of living crisis.
Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with some of that. I think the form of drinking that I'm worried about is not the form of drinking in which people come together in pubs, in their community, talk about their world, their society, make friends. That is something that is so important in a country in which some of our public institutions and spaces have just been decimated. Pubs really matter.
And it clearly is the case. Sometimes you drink 3 schooners rather than 2 pints.
Well, that's the thing.
No, but I mean, there are. I mean, I think you can't. It's a kind of non sequitur to say that pubs are great things where people come together and therefore the government shouldn't intervene with regulation, because by definition, the last Labour government banned smoking in pubs. That did lead to some pub closures. The new Labour government is planning to ban smoking in pub gardens, which has caused a bit of a backlash. So if you're going to say that the pub is a fantastic community space, what you're effectively saying is hands off from the government. So I think it is perfectly acceptable to say what are the kind of interventions, so long as you leave port scratchings out of it, what are the kind of interventions we can make which might perhaps make people lead a slightly healthier life. And even 10% difference in kind of what you consume can make a big difference to your health.
I think they're coming for your pork scratchings,
First they came for the pint.
Salt and sugar.
That's the nudge unit that you've been talking about. Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Give us more or we'll strike again, warn junior doctors. Senior British Medical Association figure says 22% deal agreed this week is a compromise and first step. Paul, should the junior doctors go back for more?
Well, I don't represent the BMA. They're not part of the TUC's 5.3 million
All right,
members.
that's your disclaimer. Now, should they go back for more?
Well, listen, first of all, I think it was right that the government broke the deadlock with the junior doctors because that was a 2-year dispute, and I think it was a grown-up approach to industrial relations. It was right for the government to accept the recommendations of the pay review bodies. We've got a recruitment and retention crisis in the NHS, but right across our public services. And part of resolving that crisis has got to be addressing concerns about pay. Now, at the TUC, we've said, and I think that the junior doctors will be in exactly the same position, nobody wants to be in a position of taking industrial action. We've said at the TUC the government should set up a public services workforce commission to look at issues around pay, but recruitment and retention, workloads, flexible working. There's a sensible conversation to be had about how we staff our public services. And I hope that the government will take that more sensible, grown-up approach rather than the approach we had the last couple of years where, frankly, the government refused to get round the table for months and months on end.
Is it a grown-up process or giving in to unions?
Well, I think that actually the deal that seemed to be on the table December of last year is about 1 percentage point lower than what was, from the Conservatives, is about 1 percentage point lower than what was agreed just now. So I'm not convinced that there is a night and day approach from the two governments. What's interesting is 2 things. Number one, this deal was reached without any conditions around reform or improving the management structure or all the things that have been raised in the Daza report about the need to reform the NHS. So I think there was a missed opportunity there to get some buy-in or at least some support for apparently the reforming mission of this government when it comes to the NHS. I think the second thing is obviously that it probably hasn't worked. I mean, the indications from the residential doctors, not junior doctors anymore, is that they are going to be, they have a lot more to say and they maybe have a lot more strike action on the table. So I think this issue is not one and done, as Wes said in that clip.
But the difference is that the previous government sat on this issue, presided over that industrial chaos for 2 years. Wes Streeting resolved that dispute in 2 weeks, and that is the difference. And I hope it does lead to beginnings of a more sensible discussion about how are we going to staff our public services going forward, because it's not just in the NHS. We've got crisis in our classrooms. You can't get people to work for HMRC to collect taxes. There needs to be a grown-up conversation about how we reward people in the public services, and I think the government's on the right track.
Are they on the right track? Should they have given those pretty significant pay rises? Because now we see junior doctors perhaps looking ahead to full pay restoration, and we've already had, of course, the drivers, the RMT boss now saying he wants the same pay deal as drivers under ASLEF.
Yeah, look, I think in what Paul said and what Anita said, you've got the kind of horns of the dilemma this government has. The first point is, have they resolved the junior doctors' pay dispute? They've made one pay settlement with them, but we know that there may be pay disputes down the road which might prove more problematic and more difficult to afford. And secondly, I agree with Anita that the key thing here in these pay deals has always been pay plus reform. Now, you've got the Darzai report.
What does that look like,
Lord
reform?
Darzai.
I mean, as a condition, what would that look
Well,
like?
Lord Darzai, it was commissioned by this Labour government, pulled out in about 8 weeks. It's a very hard-hitting, very easy to read, no jargon report with amazing stats. And this is not, not a partisan point because the Tories were in power for 14 years. The NHS is 15 years behind most organisations in terms of the technology it uses. So you've got to get reform. I mean, Paul said the BMA are not a member of the TUC. He's lucky. They're a pretty militant trade union. People forget doctors have been militant since the creation of the NHS. So it's a very tough position. But there is no doubt, and I think Wes Streeting, from what I've seen of him, appears a really quite impressive guy. He talked about reform long before the election, so he put his cards on the table. But we are not going to get through this without reform of the NHS. We can't simply keep writing cheques either to junior doctors or to the NHS and expect things to improve without radical reform.
Has the government made a rod for its own back?
No, I agree. We're not going to get anywhere long-term in building the kind of NHS that's equipped for the future without reform. The mistake is to think that these negotiations are the place to do it. That's just not the right way to think about it at all. In fact, you cannot reform the NHS when doctors are out on picket lines. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 2 years. And to say there is no difference is just nonsense. The Conservative ministers had not met the junior doctors since March. That's a big deal because it's about the relationships that you build.
But what we're trying to say is, has it resolved the strikes? I mean, has it actually ended the disputes?
Well, of course, trade unions, their job is to represent their workers and push for the best deal possible. That's different to the government, which is going to negotiate. And actually what happened in this was restoration did not happen. They did not get what they wanted. No. And the government negotiated hard. And the government will always keep doing that because the government will act in the national interest, not any particular setting.
But should a Labour government pursue full pay restoration for public sector workers?
I think pay restoration for public sector workers is absolutely a legitimate aspiration.
Okay.
But let's not just think about junior doctors. I mean, last year I was on picket lines with physiotherapists, never taken industrial action about pay ever before in their entire history. Why? Because we were in the midst of a cost of living crisis and they were getting below inflation pay rises. I think it's really important that we listen to and respect the views of those public sector workers. Ed talked about reform. I think everybody who works in the NHS would agree that it needs reform, from clinical support workers to support staff to people on the medical front line. How you get that reform is involving the staff, listening to their ideas, getting them on board, not doing reform to them. So I think it's really important to reset relationships in the NHS, that we got this deal with the junior doctors. Going forward, discussion and dialogue and partnership is the way forward.
I think that's all very noble in terms of aspirations and tone setting. But fundamentally, you're never at your most powerful in a government. And first of all, at the very beginning of your government. And secondly, when you've got something on the table that others want. And I think it was a missed opportunity to really talk about some of the issues, like how to improve productivity, how to ensure the management structures, the things that Labour themselves have identified as problems. Where is the buy-in for the particular reforms that need to be seen? Like, this is a kind of thing that does take a very, very long time. And if you don't see that work now and get agreement on it now, it will take you far too long and the public will not see the benefit, which is kind of what Labour, I presume, are going for before the next general election.
Well, interestingly, on that line, in August, some WhatsApp messages were leaked to The Times from Robert Lawrenson, co-chairman of the Junior Doctors Committee of the BMA. And he reportedly told members they should consider striking for a better deal in the future when Keir Starmer's government are politically vulnerable. Labour were in a honeymoon period and those strikes might not make an impact right now, but there would be a window of opportunity next year. What do you make of that?
It's not up to me to comment on their tactics. What I will emphatically say is that the right way to achieve reform in the NHS is not to use your power after you've got into government to say, this is what we're going to do, walk away or accept the deal. Reform only works if it has the support of everybody in the NHS. And in fact, it is those people who most want to see reform. And so the right approach here is to reset relations, get doctors off the picket line, back in hospitals, and then have a conversation about what exactly long-term reform is.
The fundamental problem we've got is that we've got 300,000 staff vacancies in the NHS and social care. You're not going to solve those issues by pretending that pay and reward and all those other issues I talked about are things that need to be addressed. So I think it makes sense to do that in the round, through that Public Service Workforce Commission that we've proposed.
But I mean, you make a really good point there. Where is the social care reform? Because a lot of the frustrations from doctors is not actually just about pay. It's also about the ways in which they're being very inefficient because social care isn't fixed. Another metal that should be grasped now in order to see the benefits that doctors and others want to see in the NHS.
While we're discussing the NHS and reforms or not, Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, is giving a speech as we're on air about the NHS, and we'll keep listening to it. Not me personally, but somebody will keep listening to it while we're on air. Well, let's look at this headline. We want the same pay deal as drivers, I referred to a little bit earlier, says the RMT boss. That's because ASLEF broadly got 13% for drivers, and now the RMT expect parallel synchronised offer to ASLEF. So I ask again, have the government been too quick and hasty in giving these pay rises?
No, what the government are doing, I mean, just remember where we were a few months ago. Trains weren't working because they were on strike. Hospitals were on their knees. The NHS was broken. And what the government are doing is saying, in order to do anything that is future focused, that is about reform, that is about improving public services, we have to solve that problem. And that is exactly what you've seen. Trains are starting to run. The doctors, have now got this deal, and that will make sure that they're not on picket lines. They're having a conversation about reform. And that is exactly what the public want from this government.
I mean, and strikes cost money too, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Ed Vaizey. I mean, I think it was £1.7 billion in the NHS strikes alone. That's obviously funding staffing strike days.
And that was a very powerful argument that Wes Streeting used, that you're going to save money by giving the pay rise now. But, I mean, I think it is the case that, there has to be, a partnership with the TUC from the government. Trade unions exist for good and noble purposes, but they also exist to get the absolute best pay deals for their members. And, the leaked WhatsApp messages about tactics and the idea that the RMT will now follow on behind ASLEF following a pay deal, that's what trade unions will do. So the government, I think Anita is right, the government has to show some backbone. It cannot allow what might be a very sensible decision to settle pay disputes early now, get people back to work, and then deal with reform to become a signal that every time a union asks for a pay demand, they think this government is a pushover, we're going to just keep pushing.
And to be clear, just on the junior doctors, since that's what we're talking about, that is exactly what happened. They asked for pay restoration. They did not get that. There was lots of what they asked for that they didn't get. And that, is a clear demonstration of the fact that the government will always negotiate. That's the government's job, unlike the last government. But that does not mean that the other side of the negotiating table will always get what they want.
But how will it look if they come back for more when the government's vulnerable?
But just two issues on rail, Jo. I mean, Hugh Merriman, who was the former Conservative rail minister, said up front that it costs more to have the strike action to resolve the dispute. And ministers refused to meet ASLEF, the train drivers' union, and the RMT for the thick end of a year. I mean, there was no negotiations taking place. The other thing that just to say is that the agreements that the government will reach on pay with the rail unions need to be set in context of broader reform of our railways. Hundreds of millions of pounds goes out the system each year to a failed system of privatisation, to train operating companies that frankly are not delivering the service that the travelling public deserves. So I think, again, this is about a fundamental reset in rail, in health, and it couldn't come soon enough.
But those headline percentage terms are obviously going to be a signal. Rightly, as Ed says, trade unions exist to get the best deal for their members. But it's a signal of 22%, fine, we should up our ambition. So there is a challenge here that the government is going to have to manage as a result of the decisions
But Anita, that was a 3-year deal. I mean, at one point we had inflation running at 13, 14% a year.
Right. I mean, is it a relief, though, for the public that the strikes for now are over?
For now.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in The Times. Its legal right to work from home will boost productivity, says Labour. Yes, remarks made by Jonathan Reynolds, the Business Secretary, vows to end culture of presenteeism to make workers more motivated and resilient. But, by contrast, BBC News reports Amazon tells staff to get back to the office 5 days a week. Who's right, Ed?
It's becoming a bit of an issue, I think. And weirdly, I've had lots of conversations this week with people running businesses who are very, very keen to see the people who work for their companies back in the office. And I think in particular, what a lot of people emphasise is the fact that people who are starting in their company, new workers, young workers who are just starting out in their careers, really need the kind of face time with more senior and experienced employees. So that is what is missing, this kind of camaraderie, teamwork.
Yeah, the
and there is
culture.
no doubt at all, you know, we do this show live and in person. It's a much better show because of it. You can't do a show like this on Zoom, and you can't really run a business if everyone is talking to each other on Zoom. Now, obviously, that does not mean that in this age of technology, you cannot be flexible, that people can't spend one day a week working from home, able to attend, say, 1 or 2 meetings on Zoom if they have to, but getting a lot of work done at home. Whether or not you want to impose more regulation on business, considering the budget that's coming down the line, I'm not sure about. It may just be a relatively benign regulation that means you'd have to give somebody a reason why they couldn't work from home. But I think the tide is turning, certainly from, I spend a lot of time with people who've founded tech companies and so on. Even in that world, it is changing, and people want people back to work. And the Amazon thing is very telling indeed. We're talking here presumably about the people who work in the office rather than people, say, working in the warehouses. And it's the same in the US. There is a backlash against this now.
What are the benefits of working from home?
Well, I think as a dad of 2 young kids, one of the benefits of flexibility is that, you know, at different phases in your life, different ways of working help you to be the most productive. And it's not going to be the same for all workers in all industries at all times of their life. And, you know, one of the absurd, mad situations of our paternity and maternity leave provision in this country is that there's a huge difference between the provisions for men and women. And one of the ways that you can help to address that is through more flexible ways of working. And that would be, you know, a very good thing for dads, for mums, for families. So there are situations in which it can be a good thing. But I think, you know, my instinct here is let businesses figure it out. You know, businesses are good at working out in the long run what's good for them. And I think that is roughly what they are doing.
But the business secretary is saying people are more productive, broadly, working from home. I mean, is there that much evidence that proves flexible working from home will make staff more productive, more motivated, more resilient?
I think there's a distinction between flexibility and just working from home. So I think Josh makes some brilliant points there, which is that fundamentally people need to be able to adapt. And so certainly, like, people starting out, as Lord Vasey says, like, it's really critical that they come to the office and get used to that. It's one of the ways that you retain employees, actually, because they have a sense of connection with their job, and it's not just a thing that's sort of faceless people behind screens. So I don't think it's about saying working from home is more productive or working in the office is more productive. It's actually having a degree of balance that suits the kind of business that you are, which allows people to be flexible. Some days you just need to get your head down, you're going to be working from home, or you have childcare responsibilities or something going on and you need to be at home. But other days you benefit from the business as a whole if people are in the office able to do those incidental conversations that do really help to upskill people, particularly younger in their careers.
But there is this push and pull, isn't there? There is this tension now at the very heart of where we should be working. How can companies run their businesses, or how can you run public sector organisations if you haven't got staff at work for part of the week?
But if you talk to employers, public and private sector employers, actually, Jo, up and down the country, the biggest issue they've got is recruiting staff and keeping hold of skilled staff. And so flexible working is a way of addressing that, giving individuals the flexibility, but also helping companies. And it's important that we don't just reduce it to home working. That's an important element, but for some people it'll be starting later in the day, finishing early so they can pick up the kids, doing a compressed working week. But I think that the government's proposals
and should it be a legal right then from day one?
Yeah, absolutely. And employers, if they're not able to offer that flexible working, should need to demonstrate why they're not able to offer that why they're not able to offer that flexible working. I would just put in one note of caution, though, because it does often get reduced to home working or not. Yeah. I mean, if you think about during the pandemic, 70% of people who lived in Richmond-on-Thames worked from home. 14% of those in Burnley work from home, partly because of the types of jobs they do. So for me, flexible working's got to be for everybody, not just those who are lucky enough to be able to.
Well, it's also about the type of homes you might have. It's not always that comfortable to be at home
Quite
all day if you're sharing.
Staff, for example, lower paid staff haven't got the home office set up or whatever it might be.
I think it is unhelpful. I think I haven't seen the full quote, so forgive me, but to sort of say this is more productive than that, because I do think it does depend on the type of business and lots of other things. And I think businesses should be trusted, this is where I disagree with Paul, to make those decisions because they want to retain and recruit people. So I think they'll make the decision that allows them to retain and recruit people.
Sometimes it's just easier, Anita, for an employer to default position say no without any justification at all. And I think what this will do is redress the imbalance in workplaces where all too often people don't get the flexibility they need, not because their employer can't provide it, but just because it's easier for the employer just to say, no, sorry, that's the set shift pattern or whatever it might be. So I think this is about just a useful rebalancing in the workplace.
I think that's happening. I think I am seeing a cultural shift. Maybe it's more in office work, but there is a cultural shift around expectations with this.
Presenteeism, was that ever a good thing anyway, that culture, or was it?
No, not really. I mean, the kind of cliche of the jacket on the back of the seat, and there are different countries where that culture is very, very prevalent, where you can't leave before the boss has left to go for home. So, I mean, I think what we're saying here really is, to a certain extent, employers know best how to run their business and make it most effective, and I think that is why there is this employer backlash against work from home, because they understand that people working together in an environment makes a huge impact on their productivity. But I think, again, most employers should be, I mean, what we're talking about is how deeply do you regulate this environment?
Yeah.
Most employers will work out something that suits people. People have got used to working from home. The technology exists to work from home. They will work out a system that is best for them. How far should the government intervene in that is the big question.
Well, on that, Josh, let me show you this headline in The Times. Labour not enforcing 3-day office week for civil servants. While the rule introduced by the Conservatives is not being formally changed, ministers are said to be taking a more relaxed attitude to where staff work. You may remember the then Cabinet Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, going round offices in Whitehall and left a note for civil servants saying, sorry you were out when I visited.
And that is, of course, the context in which Jonathan Reynolds was saying what he was saying. He was pushing back against this sort of mad cultural vendetta against people who sometimes chose to work from home. And, goodness knows why Jacob Rees-Mogg was so obsessed with it, but it was yet another way in which there was a sort of cultural issue that the Conservatives then would pick up on, obsessively hammer home all the time, and it absolutely made no difference to the productivity, to the working relationships in the civil service. And the contrast now is what Labour are saying is the civil service should work in the way that is most productive, and we're not going to set rules, we're not going to chase you around leaving notes on your desk in order to enforce that.
I mean, the irony is that Jacob Rees-Mogg, I've seen him railing against people working from home down the line from Somerset on GB News or any of the other channels. So it's fine for Jacob Rees-Mogg, it's just not fine for people who work.
Was it a cultural vendetta in that sense against civil servants?
I mean, I feel like Jacob did talk about it a fair amount, and I just don't think that's actually. I didn't have a lot to say about it in the sense that it felt to me as though it's really important to have strong civil service relationships. 3 days a week, having worked, as a special advisor, which is a type of civil servant, seems sensible to me, because there are a lot of incidental conversations you have around policy. I think there should be flexibility. As I said, civil service has to get, a civil servant has to get out a really long report. Why not let them sit at home with some headphones on and a cold towel and get it done? But so fundamentally, I think Josh said it had no impact. I think maybe it did actually make the relationship between ministers and civil servants more difficult, which is unhelpful. I don't think necessarily, therefore, that you should have no structure around this, because I think people can just end up disappearing into the ether and not building that team spirit and departmental spirit, incidentally, that you need if you're a mission-driven government. So I think there's a balance here, and I don't want it to tip too far in the other direction, where it's not actually delivering what you want as a department head.
Right, can I pick up on something you said about retention? Because particularly for teachers or recruiting teachers, this is the headline in the Daily Telegraph, teachers to be allowed to work from home, which feels counterintuitive in that sense. Labour will tell schools that staff do not always need to be on site in effort to improve recruitment. It's been, I think they're looking at things called the 9-day fortnight. But how would that work?
Well, just first of all, to talk about the issues in schools, something like 30%, I think it is, of newly qualified teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years. All sorts of reasons for that, but patterns of work, workload is part of the reason. So quite often it will be that teachers could spend some time at home doing lesson preparation. Not every minute of every day in school is spent in front of pupils, and so I think that eminently makes sense. quite often one of the complaints, and I heard at our Congress last week when we had representatives from the teaching unions, is that they see their peers who graduate and go into work in the city or in an office do have that flexibility, and they're in the classroom 5 days a week, every single week. So I think, again, what we want to do is get people into the classroom, keep them in the classroom. For some people, that might be working part-time. For some people, it might be compressed hours. For some people, it might be a 9-day fortnight. Finding patterns of work that allow us to hold on to qualified teachers, I think, is really important.
Good idea for teachers. I mean, the recent figures, Ed Vasey, show 43,500 teachers in England left the state sector in 2022-23.
Well, there will be, as Paul says, all sorts of reasons why teachers leave the profession. Sometimes people do it and find it's actually not for them in the end, and that's when they leave. And you'd expect most people to leave early if they don't enjoy the profession they've signed up for. But I mean, obviously it's a counterintuitive headline designed to grab your attention. It can't be sensible, obviously, if you're a teacher. Nobody, I assume, is suggesting that teachers teach on a Zoom. I keep mentioning Zoom throughout this discussion. We're
very glad you're here in
they're at home with 30 kids sitting in a classroom being taught from a screen. I can't imagine that's going to happen. I mean, again, education is one of those areas where technology has a huge role to play, as I mentioned in the NHS. A lot of technology could help teachers with their workload, the way that the traditional methods of teaching that we still adhere to, of exams and so on. You could do things in a much more sensible way, give kids a personalised curriculum. But I do think anything that eases the workload on teachers has to be a good thing. But the idea, I have no idea, to be honest, what this headline means, because it sounds totally weird.
Right. Well, on that, let's move on to this one then, and let's see if that's more understandable. The Independent saying government to hold talks on ending exploitative 0 hours contracts. What is an exploitative 0 hours contract, Paul?
Well, it's a contract that doesn't actually reflect the hours that you work. And I think what the government is talking about when it says ending exploitative 0 hours contracts is giving people the right to a contract that actually reflects the hours that they work. Right. We've got lots of people who are working 17, 18, 20, 25 hours a week, but have got a 0 hours contract, and it means that they can't plan from one week to the next how much they're going to earn. Quite often we have people, for example, booking childcare and then getting a call, and not just small employers, from some big employers the night before saying your shift is cancelled, but they can't cancel their childcare. So this gives people some guarantees about their income, and I think it's an entirely sensible thing to do.
Is that what you understand it to mean?
I mean, the point of this proposal is to say that there is a problem with productivity, jobs and pay in this country that is a fundamental constraint on growth right across the UK. And to solve that problem, we have to stop pitting businesses against workers, civil service workers against ministers. That solves no problem whatsoever, and in particular it doesn't solve the productivity problem. And actually this is a shared problem in which there is usually an alignment of interest between businesses and workers, between ministers and civil servants. Yeah. And what you've seen from this government is a very sensible approach of saying, let's work out how we can build this programme of reforms together.
Right, well, that sounds great. But what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is, are all 0 hours contracts exploitative by their very nature or not?
I think the detail of how to define a 0 hours contract that is exploitative is still being worked out through negotiation and conversation.
I mean, there definitely will be people who are genuine freelancers, for example, who do work on a de facto 0 hours contracts. We have people working in the entertainment industry, the creative industries, who are genuine freelancers and don't have set hours. But the vast majority of those 0 hours contracts are actually people who are working week in, week out, but their employer doesn't give them guarantees about the hours that they work. Now, 80% of the staff who run those contracts say they prefer guaranteed hours. 75% of employers, actually, that we surveyed just a couple of weeks ago, said actually ending 0 hours contracts would boost productivity. The vast majority of employers in this country do not use 0 hours contracts. And I don't think it's right that the good employers are undercut by the cowboys who do.
Right. I mean, should they be banned altogether, 0 hours contracts?
I think that we had a very lively debate about this from kind of 2015, probably for 4 or 5 years, as it was quite a big policy for Ed Miliband, for example, or 2015 before then. I think that what we saw was that some people prefer 0 hour contracts for particular reasons in particular sectors, and there are others who end up having a kind of agreement around a minimum number of hours. It feels like it's one of the proposals in the New Deal for Working People that requires a lot of consultation and probably quite a lot of time, because if you want to make adjustments to this, you have to make sure, well, I would hope that the government wants to make sure they're not damaging productivity and they're not putting people in a more unsuitable situation where they have less flexibility as a result of being on a number of minimum hours that don't work for them. So I'm not clear that the balance right now is wrong, but I think it requires quite a lot of detailed consultation to identify the problem, and then you kind of need to trust the government that they're going to come back with something that actually helps the small minority of people for whom it does not work and they don't seem to be able to reach another agreement with their employer.
Let me just bring you this news, since it was part of our last discussion. ASLEV Union have tweeted that members have voted yes on the offer to end our national pay dispute. The vote to accept was 96.6%, with a turnout of 88.5%. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. We talked about it earlier in the week, but Starmer's £100,000 in tickets and gifts, more than any other recent party leader. Yes, he's declared more freebies, it seems, and gifts than any other major party leaders in recent times, particularly with his recent gifts in terms of funding his wife's clothes, or some of them, from Labour donor Wahid Ali. What do you make of all this?
Well, one of the things that really gets my goat, so to speak, is the laziness in just concluding that they're all the same.
Whose laziness?
Well, the Tories like to try to basically paint Keir Starmer as the same as Rishi Sunak and the same as Boris Johnson, and they are not.
Right. Well, what is the difference, though, Josh? Please spell it out for me.
Here is the difference. Keir Starmer is not a man who is independently wealthy and can afford to buy fancy suits and fancy clothes. He is now the Prime Minister of this country and wants to go around the world looking, like the Prime Minister of this country. And his office have twice independently reached out to the relevant Parliamentary Standards Authority to check what the relevant disclosures are. It was a proactive checking what those...
And then when they realise... watching the programme, though, will think £160,000 or thereabouts, which is what the Prime Minister earns, is a significant amount of money.
No, it's not to say he's, poorly paid compared to the rest of the country. He, of course, is extremely well paid. But he's also, compared to the last Prime Minister, not independently wealthy and not able to afford some of the things that, they do. And it's not a hard-up point. The point is that, as a man of integrity, he worried that the way that it was reported to the Parliamentary Standards Authority was not right, so his office proactively reached out. That is a stark contrast to two previous Prime Ministers who were fined by the police for breaking the law. Those are not the same thing, and we should not allow ourselves in public debate to think that they are the same thing.
Right. Ed?
Well, I don't think you have one rule for poor Prime Ministers and one rule for rich Prime Ministers. You've got to have the same rules for everyone. And look, I was the Culture Minister. I'm king of the freebies. So, I went to the theatre and the opera as a Culture Minister.
Well, thank you for disclosing.
People in glass houses should not throw stones, but that applies to Keir Starmer as well. You can't kind of take chunks out of the last Tory government for accepting freebies and then do it yourself. Having said all that, I would say two things. First of all, I have no problem with Frockgate, with Keir Starmer getting clothes from Wahid Ali. As you can probably tell by looking at me, I was the fashion minister for 6 years. I know what it's like to present yourself properly.
So why didn't you dress better for the show?
I think that I don't have any problem with our Prime Minister looking the part. And also I hate it when people kind of have attack of the vapours. Wahid Ali has undue influence because this. Wahid Ali is a Labour Party peer. He's supported the Labour Party all his life. He's got influence because he's been a party servant all his life, in the same way that someone like Peter Mandelson has influence based on their experience. So I have no problem with that. But all I would counsel is, I think all Keir Starmer's Arsenal tickets have been properly declared. Don't tie yourself up in not saying I have to go to a corporate box because I can't sit in the stands. And do just say, take it on the chin. Know that people are going to have a pop at you, but also be slightly cautious the next time a Labour MP gets up and has attacks a Tory MP.
There's more than a grain of truth in that, though. For my sins, I'm an Evertonian, so things are pretty miserable for me at the moment. But
can't do
on
anything about
Saturday,
that.
I'll go to the match with my brother and I'll sit in the stand. If you're the Prime Minister, you can't just rock up and sit in the stand.
Hang on, let's just show you
you've
this,
got
because
arm
Rishi
protection. There's
Sunak,
no
Rishi
better way to
Sunak,
sit
when
in
he
the
was
stand.
Prime Minister, he stood there, he was on the football terraces supporting his team,
There is a real
Southampton.
risk around political violence in this country. We've had MPs attacked and murdered in this country, and I think, you know, the Prime Minister is not just going to rock up and sit in the same seat, in the same stand
I've
every
sat
time
in
he goes to the
stands
football.
with Michael Gove. There's no more dangerous
the key thing is,
thing
from
to
my
do
point of
than
view,
that.
Right.
I think fundamentally Keir is a man of integrity. I think it's important that there's transparency and that he not just plays by the rules, but stays within the spirit of the rules, which is what I think he would want to do. Clearly, I think there's been missteps in the way that this has been handled and communicated. This is a million miles away, to pick up Josh's point, from things like PPE contracts being handed out to Conservative donors, willy-nilly, hundreds of millions of pounds. Frankly, I'm not going to advise the Prime Minister on what events he should or shouldn't accept tickets to, but fundamentally, do I believe he's a decent man with integrity? I do.
I think this is a problem. I think Josh did his absolute best, and as did Paul there. But fundamentally, you know, Keir Starmer made a big deal out of things like wallpaper gate, right? And I don't really understand the comparison to Rishi Sunak going to having a slice of cake. I think the idea that the best defence you've got is that he actually did declare the rules is not the point. The point is, do the rules really make sense to most members of the public? Does it correspond with the spirit of expectations of the public when it comes to what counts as influence or what kinds of things they should be receiving from donors or not? Like, I think that, I mean, I must confess, I'm not a kind of crazy football fan, but I sort of was completely baffled by that defence of well, I should never go to Arsenal again. Well, I mean, you do get to be the Prime Minister. I mean, maybe it's a shame that you don't get to go to a nice box to watch the match. You can watch it from home, I guess. I think there are some things that is really important. If Keir Starmer has said, I'm a man of integrity and I'm not someone who's going to be subject to undue influence, I think this isn't a great look, actually, for the Prime Minister, and I'm not sure he's considered it that carefully. That he got £2,000, £2,500 for a pair of glasses. Why can't Keir Starmer buy his own glasses? I think some of this is a problem.
Why can't he?
And I'm not convinced that actually,
where Keir
when it comes
Starmer
to...
sits in the stands, where he gets his glasses from, this is a distraction. The simple difference...
It isn't, because it's publicly
is
declared as a result of the fact that he got this money from donors.
I know that. But the fundamental question is, do you respect the rules of this country,
No, it's not
or
that.
do you break them? Yes, it absolutely is. That is what integrity means. Keir Starmer respects the rules of this country to the extent that he has asked his office to proactively reach out to the Parliamentary Standards Authority, knowing that we would be talking about it because it is the right thing to do. Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson broke the rules of this country and then were fined for it.
Right.
That is fundamentally different.
Let's stick with the Conservative Party just for a moment. Sir John Major, who was Prime Minister between 1990 and 1997, has been speaking to the BBC about the future of the Conservative Party. Let's take a listen.
I think a large part of our nation is by instinct centre-right. Not far-right, but centre-right. And the only party that can legitimately appeal to the centre-right is the Conservative Party. And that is what we have to do. We have to decide where our natural support really lies and appeal to them. People may have made a misjudgment about the last election. We lost 5 seats to Reform UK, and people are jumping up and down, and some rather reckless people are saying, well, we must merge with them. Well, that would be fatal. We lost 50 to the Liberals, and we lost a huge amount to Labour. We lost the vote on the left more than on the right.
Do you agree with Sir John Major?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is 1997 all over again, and I had this battle. At that point, I was an aspiring Tory candidate, and I wanted to get my party back in the centre ground. That's where you win elections from. And the Tory party's problem all the time is that they have this kind of nostalgia for a country that never existed, and they fail to account for the fact that the country that they are in is the country that they helped to create. You know, Margaret Thatcher presided, weirdly, over a huge kind of liberalisation of Britain, not just in terms of financial liberalisation, economic liberalisation, but actually also moral liberalisation, if I can put it that way. You have to accept the country as it is. You can't turn the clock back. And the other point is, you know, I'm not saying you shouldn't address the issues that animate the far right, like immigration. Those are important issues to voters. But if you just lurch your party over to that narrow perspective, you do, as John Major points out, miss out on a whole swathe of the electorate who basically turfed out the Tories because they were incompetent, not because they weren't right-wing enough.
Very briefly, because we haven't got long, Kemi Badenoch, leadership candidate most popular with party members, says the opposite. She says Reform UK supporters are our people.
I think that actually, I mean, I mostly agree with Ed and John Major, which is that fundamentally we have to occupy that centre ground. I'm just not convinced that this leadership debate has been really preoccupied by reform. I think that's actually a very small part of the conversation that's been taking place.
Right, but I suppose it's which way they turn, whoever wins this election. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back with more Politics Live tomorrow here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. But from all of us, have a very good afternoon.